Hi everyone, welcome to the Empower Sounds podcast. My name is Mahika, and today we are joined by the founder of Bloody Good Period, the amazing Gabby, and she's going to talk to us about periods and all the struggles that people who menstruate face in terms of access, whether that be to products, period poverty, access to information, education, and everything else. I really hope that you learn. I really hope that you enjoy and that you take away a lot from this episode. It's a really, really interesting one. Let me know what you think in the podcast Instagram. And I think Spotify lets you comment now, which is awesome. So let me know in the comments. Rate and review the show if you like it. Let me know what else you want to see. And I hope you enjoy the episode. Amazing. Well, Gabby, welcome to the Empower Sounds podcast. Could you please start by introducing yourself and share a little bit about your background and your journey?
Yeah, of course. So thank you for having me. I'm really happy to be here and to be chatting to you. My name's Gabby Jahanshahi-Edlin, and I'm the founder and former CEO of Bloody Good Period. I grew up in Manchester, in a Jewish community, and I have been a North Londoner for 14 years now. Um, in May 2021, I handed over Bloody Good Period and Bloody Good Employers to my second in command at the time, Rachel. And now I freelance as what I like to call a brand nurturer, which is essentially a brand strategist, but with a much more sort of holistic and feminine sort of slant to it, I think.
Wow, that's so interesting. And before we dive into your career and the journey that you've been through with Bloody Good Period and now becoming a brand nurturer, I want to talk more about you. So, in another interview, you said that you were always a creative child and that you wanted to be a fashion designer when you were younger. How do you think your creative dreams have shaped the creative voice that you have and the trajectory of your career? And why do you think it's so important that women should nurture their creative voices when going into entrepreneurship or starting their own personal brand or just starting their own venture?
Yes, I was a very creative child, and a much more artistic child, I think, especially I'm more artistic than I am now. But like when you think about creativity, I guess it's the imagining a different way or imagining something else. And that was really like the driving force behind Bloody Good Period. So what Bloody Good Period wasn't was just a service that did a thing that needed to be done. It was all of that. And it was very much like my creativity that noticed, hey, there's a gap in the market here, so to speak. Something's not being done. And that was maybe sort of my more like sensitive side that noticed that. I'm a very sensitive person, like for better or for worse. Um, but I picked up on something that wasn't being done. And my creative side was like, okay, well, let's do something about it. And as well as let's do something about it, like providing a service, which how it started was providing period products for asylum seekers and refugees in the UK. It was also like, yeah, but why is it happening? And what are the reasons behind this situation that we're in? And then once we found these reasons, how do we change that? So it was all about sort of like, I guess, like breaking things apart and seeing how you could fix them or how you could imagine a new scenario. So one of the things that Bloody Good Period is known for, aside from a really compassionate delivery service and education, is this really creative brand that wasn't seen anywhere, especially in like the charity sector. There was very little sort of openness and frankness and like just a really big sense of fun around periods, around sort of female health, around sort of injustice as well. And I think that was all my sort of creativity coming out and saying, like, no, I don't like the way it's been done before. I want to do it like this. Um, and, I think also just how Bloody Good Period started, if anyone sort of ever saw it right at the beginning, it was really just a lot of testing things out and trying things out and a lot of silliness as well. The subject matter is deadly serious and we would never laugh at that. But periods are something actually we can laugh at a lot of the time. And the way the sort of messed up way that we think about them or have thought about them in society, like we can laugh at that too.
Hmm.
Um, and there was always very like an artistic slant with BGP as well. So so much of the communications and branding is like based on audience participation. So people illustrating, people creating artwork. Like if anyone's ever seen the giant glittery tampon, all of these types of things are all just really like massive expressions of creativity and
Hmm.
female creativity, like you were saying, or at least creativity of people who have periods.
That's super interesting. And before we dive more into everything that you said, just for any of our listeners who don't have the context, can you please tell us a little bit about the philosophy of what Bloody Good Period is? Like, how did it start? Like, can you talk about how your volunteering experiences shaped like your desire to start this venture and what it actually like is?
Sure. So what it is, Bloody Good Period is a charity. And what the charity does is provide period products for asylum seekers, refugees, and anyone who can't access them. It also provides education for anyone who menstruates around reproductive health, sexual health, basically anything in the underwear. It also is an advocacy platform as well. So Bloody Good Period fights for menstrual equity. So the idea that everybody gets to have a period that is good and, manageable. It fights for free period products for everybody in the UK, and for an end to the stigmas and taboos and the shame around menstruation. And it started because I was volunteering at a drop-in centre via a synagogue in North London, and the drop-in centre was specifically for asylum seekers who had been in the UK for quite some number of years, so we're still awaiting their refugee status if they're even lucky enough, quote unquote, to get it. And we received the list of essentials that were going to be given out, and period products weren't on there. And I had recently read an article by the journalist Maya Oppenheim, which talked about what homeless women do on their periods. And the answer was, it's really bloody tough. And so I had that in my head when I saw this list. And so I asked if we'd be able to provide period products for the clients at the drop in centre. And I was told that there just wasn't enough space, there wasn't enough funding, and it was just something that they weren't able to sort of cater for. So I said, right, I'll do it. And I put a status on Facebook at the time, this was 2016, and said that I was collecting period products for this asylum seeker drop in centre. I put a link of places to buy them. And pretty quickly, I had an absolute flood, pun intended, of pads coming through my door, and it just didn't stop. And so gradually I began to develop this service whereby I was taking period products to this one refugee drop-in centre, to this one, sorry, asylum seeker drop-in centre, and taking it to other drop-in centres and eventually growing it into an organisation which got people to volunteer to pack up pads, got people to volunteer their artwork and their writing and their event planning and their fundraising, all to be able to create this a place where basically nobody had to worry about their periods anymore because they couldn't afford products. And now in 2024, I no longer work for Bloody Good Period. I handed it over 2 years ago, but it's a medium-sized charity with permanent members of staff and a really good education program, and the period products go out to dozens and dozens of drop-in centres all over the UK. And also they are really strong advocates for period equality, and for everything surrounding that, and ultimately with the mission to no longer exist. So it shouldn't really be the way in a wealthy country such as the UK that people are having to go without period products. We already get condoms free. We already have toilet paper and soap available in all public toilets. Why not period products too? So that's where we are. And a huge amount has changed since I first delivered that first box of pads to the drop-in centre. Um, hundreds and hundreds of centres all over the UK receiving free products. The idea of periods has changed in the public domain. We talk about them differently. You know, I've really realised how much impact we've begun to make when I started getting emails from school kids. And I thought, God, I would not have had that bravery at 15 years old to talk about periods in school, aside from with my friends. So, just seeing that impact and seeing these like really cool teenagers who were like shouting about period poverty, creating vulva cupcakes and tampon cupcakes and selling them, like, that I realized that everything has begun to change and there's no going back, I hope.
Well, it's remarkable what you've created, and it's so endearing to hear about. Not only did Bloody Good Period give the resources to people who really needed it, but also opened up a conversation that was really important to have. When you started working on it through your experiences, why do you think that is like this kind of stigma and this gap in funding and policy and the market for why do you think that period poverty like prevails and exists and is so like systemic?
So the first thing is obviously there is so much poverty throughout the world, and especially, in the UK, we can see it really clearly. Now it's called the cost of living crisis. Back in 2016, it was just called poverty. And period products, because they are primarily used by women, they are seen as a cosmetic, as a luxury. Less so now. I really think we've changed that conversation. But back then, they were really seen as something like additional. And that even gets into sort of people's psyches. So we would always hear from mothers who said, well, I've got this much money to go to the end of the month. There's absolutely no way I'm going to be able to put myself first because I've also got my family, I've got my children, we've got to pay for transport, we've got to pay for food, we've got to pay for heating. Period products just come to the bottom of that list. It's inevitable. And so that's one of the reasons, because people just don't have enough money to get the things that they need. And that's compounded by shame and stigma. So periods have been around since the dawn of humanity. That's how we're born. But there has also been, for, I don't know, hundreds of years, there's been this really intense shame attached to them. There's been, that's been the case in so many religions. That's been the case in all of advertising, has marketed them as something secret and shameful. And the way that mothers talk to daughters and their children about periods is that we have to keep them secret because they are dirty, quote unquote, they are shameful, quote unquote, there's something that everybody doesn't need to know about. And so when you combine this literally lack of being able to purchase the things that you absolutely need with this massive shame and stigma where you can't even talk about it, that was where we were at that point where people were not even able to ask for period products in these centres because it was so humiliating to have to ask for something like that. And, often, especially with asylum seekers, we're talking about people who have been treated so badly, dehumanized by systems, that even the most essential things they begin to expect that they won't be helped with. So, as I said, when you think about that list, period products come to the bottom, but they are by no means not essential. When you think about the health risks that come with using products for too long or not using products at all, or the risks of bad mental health that comes from having to worry about leaking and having to worry about not having the products that you need, all of that just combines to create this soup of like inequality that has so many sort of impacts on the world and so many impacts on people who are suffering from it. And we all suffer from a lack of education about periods. It's not something that we have a lot of education about in school, maybe a little bit in biology, maybe we have one talk and they send the boys out of the room. It's we were all suffering from like a massive lack of understanding about our bodies, and things are very happily changing, but not fast enough.
Thank you for unpacking that really complex like issue from and like making it more accessible for the audience. You mentioned earlier when we were talking about shame about these teenage girls at 15 years old fundraising and everything, and how you at 15 wouldn't have had the courage. So, as well as talking about how society has worked on overcoming the stigma, what has been your personal journey going from maybe at 15 years old not being able to talk about it with other people apart from your friends to posting it on the internet and starting a company and becoming the founder and the kind of face of a company associated with period issues? Like, what was your journey with overcoming that shame and talking about something that you might have also had your own personal issues with?
That's a very good question. No one's ever asked me that before, actually. Um, so when I started BGP, I was 30 years old. So I was it at the point probably where I was like, I didn't really have that kind of awkward teenage shame anymore, which I think just comes from being a teenager. That's not to say that I would go around shouting about my periods by any stretch. And actually, in a lot of the work that we did with BGP, I wouldn't necessarily talk about my period. I don't think anyone's interested in my period. And that's the difference between something being secret and private, right? We would never at BGP say to someone, you need to be proud of your period and talk about it all the time. Like, it's still private and it's okay for it to be private, but it doesn't need to be a secret. So it doesn't need to be something that you're told not to talk about. So I think by the time I had started Bloody Good Period, I was probably a little bit more confident about that kind of thing. But really, it was understanding the issue and seeing. So once I asked about the period products, and the first time that I collected them, I was really shocked by a couple of other volunteers who said to me, take this box of pads that I'd brought in, let's put them under the table. And then you can give them out to people as and when they ask. And that was like a moment for me where I was like, no, we can't do that, because if we do that, we're making people even more embarrassed. And no one's going to come up to you and say, can I have period products? And I don't want to create this whisper system where if you were in the know, you would get to receive period products. If someone had told you that they had them over there, I was like, no, out in the open. So pretty quickly, I just had to be like, right, I guess I'm comfortable with them too. Like, I guess I am, and it was almost just the idea that it was like, it's so ridiculous. This is a part of our bodies and our biological, necessity. This is a biological necessity that so many people are suffering. I think that it just took the shame away. I was like, we haven't got time. We haven't got time to have these taboos and shames and he isn't this embarrassing. Um, and using humor really eased that for me. So I had done a master's not too long before, and I had sort of dedicated it to feminism and men and comedy. And I was really interested in how we could get men to talk about feminism using comedy. And I discovered that comedy basically, it's sort of, for lack of a better word, it lubricates everything. It makes everything much easier to talk about. People are relaxed. And so I used the same thing in terms of Bloody Good Period and was just like, well, yeah, we all might be a little bit embarrassed, but actually this is like pretty funny too. And so I think that was really sort of what was happening. And around the time feminism was regrowing again, and women and people who menstruate were sort of feeling able to talk about this stuff. You know, before this, Instagram was just you people just used to share their holiday snaps. But around this time that I was starting Bloody Good Period, there were all these other accounts that were like breaking the ice on these issues and opening up. And I was lucky enough to be in this world basically where talking the way that I spoke was kind of encouraged, and having this lack of like taboo and shame was actually like, yeah, pretty good. So yeah, I think I just had to get over it, because there wasn't really any choice if I wanted to do this work and if I wanted to do the work well. But yeah, like I said, like never feeling like I had to talk about my own body if I didn't feel like it.
That's really interesting. And I think I want to touch more on what you talked about with your masters, because I think that's super fascinating about like feminism and men and comedy, because what you mentioned about earlier, how in school we maybe had one talk in biology class or PSHE where they took the boys out. It means that first of all, like when we talk about our periods, sometimes we talk about with our friends or our moms, like you said, there's this whole whisper conversation of, oh, like, do you have a pad or do you have a tampon? Can I borrow something? But only recently, like, am I seeing examples where you can say to your dad, like, oh, dad, can you go to the shop and like get this for me? Or, oh, like to your brother or to your boyfriend or to one of your friends, and you can talk about like, I'm on my period today, so I'm in pain. Like, how do you think? Do you have any advice for anyone listening who's navigating having these kind of awkward conversations and how they can talk to the men in their life as well as their mum or their sister or their friends and be able to not feel the shame about their period, but do it in like a light-hearted way where it's like it's a serious problem because like it's a serious issue because it's a health issue, but it doesn't have to be a problem, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, if I'm allowed to plug a podcast that I made about 5 years ago, Bloody Good Period made a short series called Stay in the Room. And I think that's still available on Spotify. And it was really like conversations with men about periods. And so, it was something that I was really keen to do. People kept telling me men don't want to hear about this. And yet I was getting men talking to me about it all the time. Every time, and it still happens when I gave a talk, men would come up to me and say, I've got a daughter. How do I talk to her about it? I really want to be able to be the kind of dad that she can talk to. Or, young men saying, well, I've got female housemates and I want to be able to support them, or this is what I do to support them. And I could see there's all this energy coming from men and people who don't menstruate, wanting to do something. So, that's why we created that podcast. And unfortunately, we just didn't have the time to carry on making it. But I think it's a good resource in itself. And I called it "Stay in the Room" because that would always be my advice to men if they want to start having these conversations, both from school, tell teachers to let the boys stay in the room for the talk. They should be hearing about bodies that aren't their own as well. And all the way up to being parents as well and beyond. If you're in a heterosexual couple and your partner is talking about periods with your daughter, for example, be there at the same time. You don't need to offer advice, but just be there. Make it, don't be the person who runs out and says, oh my God, I can't talk about this. And the same if it's not a heterosexual couple or it's a single parent couple or a serious single parent family or something. Like if there's a woman, for example, talking about periods to a young person, be there. Like just sit there, learn about it too, be part of it. And gradually, like that stigma will break down. Like it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take a generation, maybe two, before we have this whole lack of like gender boundary conversation. But everybody's got to be part of it. And so my advice is always to the men and to the people who don't menstruate: you make the effort, make it possible for other people. And if you menstruate and you don't want to talk about it to men, that's absolutely fine. That's totally fine. But I think that's where change is being made. And I think just being able to, wherever possible, just try and be more open about it. And that was sort of one of the reasons why the fundraising stuff and I talked about with the young people in schools worked so well, because you give people a cause to get behind. So if people are fundraising, not just for periods, but they're fundraising for people who can't access period products, it kind of gives you a little bit of armor, really, to talk about an issue that might be really personal to you. And that's why I think it worked really, really well for young people in schools, because you were able to talk about this topic, which was really personal and probably, quite difficult. But you were sort of almost projecting it in a good way into, this is a cause that we all really care about. And actually, the second conversation is, and this affects us too, and here's how. And that's what always tended to happen, is people would do a fundraiser and then they'd go on to have a conversation about it. Or they tell us that actually we ended up talking to all the boys in our school about it and it went really well, and all of that kind of stuff. So I think that's kind of what helped about it. And like I just have said before, is always doing it with a bit of a sense of fun and a sense of humor. Like you said, it's not the most serious thing in the world, but it is important.
That's fascinating, and I'll definitely link the podcast in the show notes. Thank you for sharing that because I didn't know that was a thing.
I don't know if it's any good anymore. It's so old. But like we had some good people on there.
But I really, really I really am fascinated by the idea of staying in the room. I think that's a really important part of any conversation that's to do with women's issues. I think um in this day, like feminism becomes quite a polarized thing because to be viewed as a feminist is sometimes to be seen as someone who's against men. And it's really important that women's issues are humanitarian issues. Case of period poverty, especially, it's a humanitarian issue, it's a health issue. And so it affects everyone. Like, yes, primarily the first kind of people who are directly impacted by it are women, but like everyone is impacted by it because we have people in our lives that are influenced by it and stuff. So I think the idea of staying in the room is not something that is exclusive to period poverty or to period. So thank you for bringing that up. I think so far we've talked about how it's been really like all the successes in all the conversations that you've had and getting this message across and all the support that Bloody Good Period has received in the years since it was founded. But I'm assuming that because it's an issue that has so much shame and stigma attached to it, there have been challenges, there have been times where maybe it's not been well received, or there's been some kind of pushback, or you've had to have difficult conversations or interactions. Can you please talk us through some of the challenges of your journey of making Bloody Good Period what it is?
I mean, running BGP was a constant challenge. I think running any charity is a constant challenge. And fundraising is so hard. And that often I think it probably made it more difficult that probably 50% of the places where our applications were landing were people who weren't comfortable talking about periods. And that's just that's a not a statistic, that's like a random like guess, but I think a really big proportion of people who received our applications or partnerships were not brave enough to work with us. And that's obviously not the only reason you don't get funding. Sometimes it's other things. But I think that's a really key part of it. But how we sort of changed that was we began to create a brand that people did want to be a part of, and actually other companies, for example, who did want to align themselves with a company who was out there and daring and bold, and that women and people who menstruated listened to, they were the ones who began to step in and fund us, instead of like the traditional funding routes a lot of the time. So that was a really, that was a really surprising but interesting way that we began to be able to sustain ourselves a little bit more via corporate funding. Um, Gosh, what else? I mean, just there were so many challenges with just being a female founder as well. Um, I was talking to a friend of mine today who's a male founder, and we were talking about sort of funny stories of when you were meeting with funders. And he has a really funny story. And he said, I'm sure you have the same kind of thing. And I was like, no, I don't. The stories that I have going into funding are often when I was faced with sexism. So I had a really important funder say to me, oh gosh, that's very cheeky of you, when I described this massive negotiation that I'd done for some free space. And I just thought, wow, that's a really minimizing way of describing something that you wouldn't say to a man. And that's like, that's a really light version of the kind of things that like female founders experience on a daily basis. But yeah, so I mean, it was a constant challenge, and dealing with a subject that made people really uncomfortable was really, really tricky. But even more so, almost from the beginning, since I sort of wised up to it, Bloody Good Period's been trans inclusive. It's about people who menstruate, it's for women and people who menstruate. And we had a lot of pushback. I mean, compared to the support we had, it was tiny, it was minimal, and it never stopped us doing our work and doing it really well. But it takes up time and it takes up resources, and it's scary. And being trolled is terrifying, and receiving anonymous notes to your office saying you hate all women and you're a fascist, is a really horrible thing to experience, and it really takes its toll on you. But it was something that as an organization we were just absolutely never prepared to let go of. Like, the most important thing is that people feel included. And we had trans people write to us often saying either, oh, here's something that you missed, and this is, I don't feel included here, to which we would be able to change something, or they'd write to us and say, I feel heard, I feel seen, I feel part of a movement that I didn't think included me. And so that was, a massive and consistent challenge. And like you say, feminism is polarized, and this is a part of feminism that's massively polarized as well. But the most important thing to me is that everybody gets to feel heard. And I believe at Bloody Good Period, like everybody who menstruates does get to feel heard. And that's not something that will ever change. But it was certainly a challenge.
That's fascinating. I think it's so, so important that Bloody Good Period is inclusive to all people who menstruate and that it encompasses this intersectionality of the issue. I want to ask you, talking about like what you said about receiving hate and dealing with all the challenges of being a female founder, how did you protect your mental health, your boundaries, making sure that you didn't get burnt out from the job? Because I think it's rewarding to do work that helps people and is social work, but it can also be extremely tiring because you're kind of constantly confronted with how much work there's left to do and how much change is left to be made in society as a whole and all that kind of stuff. So, what did you personally do to protect your peace, kind of while you were as a founder of a charity? And what advice would you have to other female founders, especially those working in the social work space, on how they can do that and how they can take care of themselves while they're taking care of other people?
Mm. I mean, the truth is, I didn't avoid burnout. Like I didn't step down because of burnout. I stepped down because I was ready and I'd done everything I wanted to do, and I could see that BGP needed a different type of CEO. But once I'd stopped, I had this startling realization of how ill it had made me. And I don't talk about that very often. Like, I don't think it's the most important thing to talk about. I don't think it's the most interesting thing about me either. But I was absolutely exhausted. And the honest truth is, it takes a huge amount of energy to do that kind of work, to lead an organization, to be one of the leaders of a movement. It takes it out of you. And I don't think in the beginning, for the first few years at least, I was very good at creating those boundaries and as you say, protecting my peace. I really had the idea that because I was able to do it, I should do it. And so whenever I could work, I did work. And whenever something needed doing, I would do it. And if there were someone who asked me for help, I would give it. And it really took me into the ripe old age of 36 to realize that was not a viable way to live my life. And I wish I'd learned it earlier. I wish I'd learned that I have a finite amount of energy that I can give and that's enough to give. But yeah, I really learned that like there is only so much you can do and that you don't have to do everything. And that actually often the work that you do can inspire other people to do things, which is amazing. And you get to pass the baton, and you don't need to be an activist all of your life to make a difference. So that's what I really learned. And also being an activist and being a founder CEO, like that's a lot to do. Like it's not just one or the other. Like I wasn't just being able to fight for cause, I was also managing a team and managing a massive fundraising budget and making sure that everybody was happy and healthy and being able to run this organization in an ethical way and making sure that the people that we worked with and the people who were benefiting from the work that we did were being respected and were being looked after and were all of that. So it's a huge amount. But yeah, so I learned a lot of lessons, and I think the only thing that you can really do, because it's just so prevalent in, like you say, social impact work, you feel like you can keep on giving, is to really begin to understand what you can give, what you can realistically give. Because I know that my friends and family often felt sidelined for the work that I was doing, and that's something I don't ever want to happen again. And that's just as important as doing things that change the world. It is being a good person as well, like in your actual life. So yeah, so I think if I could give advice, I would say always trying to switch off wherever you can, never overgiving, always making sure that you're taking holidays and trusting other people to get the work done while you're not there as well. It is something like a massive learning for me, and knowing that they will. And actually, people love being trusted, and people do better work when they're trusted. So all of that, I think, like I said, like in all honesty, I didn't manage it in the way that like I wish I'd been able to, but I really hope that anybody else who starts to do this kind of work because they love it and because it matters knows that it is not the central thing in your life. It's hugely important, and my God, like the rest of like womankind is so grateful that people are carrying on this work, but don't burn yourself out. It's not a badge of honor. Like it's just not. It's the worst thing. It's awful. It's like it's being ill, so yeah, that would be my advice.
Thank you for being so vulnerable with that. And I think it's something that's really important to hear because I think sometimes with, like you said, the challenges of being a female founder, women have to work twice as hard to prove that they're capable and credible and they can do it, especially with issues that aren't getting the funding, aren't getting the attention that they deserve or need to be resolved. Before we move on to your work as a brand nurturer and your transition away from Bloody Good Period, I want to end like this kind of conversation around Bloody Good Period on a positive note and celebrate all the amazing work that you did as well as talk about how it was challenging and how it wasn't always glamorous. So, can you please tell me what is one thing that you learned about yourself through being the founder of A Bloody Good Period, and what is Gabby's win from Bloody Good Period? Gabby's one big win and Gabby's takeaway.
Can I have two?
Yes, of course you can. You can have as many as you want, but
Okay, there's two that always make me think. So what did I mean? I learned that it's not a certain type of person that I thought it was that was successful as a founder. I thought it was this hard nosed, like, knows everything already, cares about the bottom line and, does things efficiently and doesn't, isn't sensitive, doesn't sort of think about everything around them. I thought that was the kind of person who was like an entrepreneur, basically. I mean, I couldn't have been more wrong. Like, I think what it takes and what I've learned about myself is that, like, being an incredibly sensitive person and not really fitting in any box and not really fitting in at all enabled me to create a movement for other people that don't fit in and are sensitive and care a lot about things. And that's something that I'm really, really, really proud of. And just seeing that people see something in the work that I've done, they see themselves in something, they feel like they belong, and that is probably the biggest win of Bloody Good Period, is that I managed to create a space where all these different types of people felt that they were part of it and belonged and still do, and no amount of financial success will ever replicate that feeling of knowing that you've created belonging. So that's what I'm seriously proud of, and what I learned about myself. And I guess the two things that always make me proudest. So one is my sister is a teacher in South London, and she sent me a photo one day just out of nowhere, and she said, my friend at another school just sent me this. And it was a book that some students, maybe GCSE level, had created about women they found inspiring. And it was like Maya Angelou and Bell Hooks and God, who else was in there? Like Ada Lovelace and me. I was in that book, and it wasn't, there were other like like living people now, but like I couldn't believe it. And somebody, so it was a page and it was like a picture of me and it was a description that they'd written of how they understood Bloody Good Period. And it said something like, what are the attributes that Gabby Edlin needed in able to create Bloody Good Period? And it was just the loveliest thing I've ever seen. And they listed this list of like compassionate skills. It wasn't like she was really good at finances, which I always thought I needed to be, or she, blah, blah, blah. It was like she was compassionate. She was strong-willed, all of these things. And honestly, like that I still have it like up in my office now, because that's the thing that inspires me more than any gigantic award I could ever win, is that, you know, these young people saw the work that I did as inspiring. So yeah. And then the other thing, I guess, which is quite niche, but like it's so important to me, is there is a new Manchester Jewish Museum in Manchester, obviously. And it's a museum that sort of talks about the Jewish experience in Manchester since immigration began there. And there is a in the central part of the museum, there's like these glass walls, and in it they have notable Mancunians. And so there's like Slazenger, the creator of Slazenger, the tennis rackets. And I think it's like Moss Bros, like the fashion label or something. And then they've got the Bloody Good Period tote bag and a flyer that says everyone deserves a bloody good period and the glittery pin. And that's in the permanent collection. And the idea that, like, because it's the kind of place that a lot of school kids will visit, the idea that these kids will go into this museum and see me as like a notable Jewish Mancunian is the coolest thing in the entire world. Like, nothing makes me more proud. So I think, yeah, I think those are the things that, like, for me, like, that is real success, and that's celebration of what I've done. And, you know, they're things that will never be taken away from me.
That's so incredible. I can't stop smiling. I couldn't stop smiling the whole time you were telling those anecdotes. It's so incredible because I think one of the whole ethos behind this podcast is talking about how success is like it manifests in so many different ways, and recognition of success can, I mean, I was going to ask you about the fact that you got interviewed on Vogue and I forgot about it, and I was going to come back to that, but talking about recognition on that scale is what you would be considering to be like the epitome of getting there. And it's so heartwarming and amazing to know that for you it's all about inspiring the young people and being someone that they can look up to, someone in your community, not just for the cause, but for other people that will follow your footsteps. And that's so amazing. And I think that speaks to who you are, and it links perfectly into what I want to talk to you about your personal brand and everything that you're doing now. But before I do that, because I did name drop the Vogue, I want to ask you about that. So you were approached by Vogue and you had an interview about Bloody Good Period. How was that experience? What insights did you gain from that? And how was that experience for you personally and for Bloody Good Period?
I'm going to really disappoint you because I really don't remember. I know I was in it. Like, I know it was an interview. And I remember that I was interviewed, and I remember being like beyond proud, but I don't remember because so much of the press that we did is you can't get yourself excited about it. That's what I learned really quickly. So the amount of things that almost happened, the amount of like near misses, the amount of like chances that almost were, like I could fill a book with them. And so I learned pretty early on with press stuff, especially, like just you just can't get excited about it. You can't assume it's going to happen. You know, you might have an email saying, "Come into Vogue tomorrow. We really want to talk to you." And then the next day, something else is being covered. That's the nature of press. That's the nature of PR. And so I'm afraid I don't remember it at all. Um, it's it was an amazing thing to be covered in it, and I know that I'm pretty sure that it was around the time that um, that Free Periods, that organization, did the period protest, and so I think it was to do with that. Um, but yeah, I don't remember, and it's funny because sometimes the things that like you put the least effort into become like the biggest things. And you can, I did like a massive interview for this magazine that I worked really hard on, and, did loads of like, stuff for them, and it never got printed, just never appeared. And so, yeah, I learned to take all of that. And this is what I tell, often the clients that I work with now, you got to take it all with a pinch of salt because it's useful and it's an amazing tool to be part of, like, mainstream media. But a lot of the time it doesn't mean very much, and it's just journalists doing their job as best they can, and often they have to cancel on you or ditch you at the last minute, or sometimes they don't get control over what they write and something gets printed wrong. And so, yeah, that's that's the honest truth about Vogue.
Thank you for sharing that because I think it links perfectly to what I was saying about before of how it's a testament to how strong of a brand that you've built that it's not about the attention. It's not, I mean, the attention obviously helps. Like being published in Vogue obviously helps get the message across to more people because it has a significant like followership. However, it's not about that. It's about actually helping people, influencing people, inspiring people. And I think that links perfectly into what we're going to talk about with personal branding and nurturing your brand and like your why and how your why has to be compelling to you. It has to be kind of an intrinsic rather than extrinsic why. And because when it's influenced by you and your mission and what you want to create and what you want to do, no press organization, company, publication, interview can make or um break it for you. So honestly, thank
Mhm.
you. Thank you for sharing that. And that leads perfectly on to our next section of the interview where I want to ask you all about your work as a brand nurturer and strategist. So can you first tell us what that means, and what your new career transition entails and how you help founders grow their companies or brands?
Yeah, I mean, I came to it because, once I left Bloody Good Period, I really didn't know what to do next. I really was like, well, what do you do after being a founder CEO? Like, the normal thing is for people is that they go on and found another thing, and they become a CEO again, or they go into like a corporate job where you're sort of get to sort of rest a little bit. And neither of them felt like good options for me. That wasn't really something that I wanted to do. I knew I didn't want to found something again. Like I really needed some downtime and I didn't want to be public facing at all. Equally, I'd had 7 years, being my own boss, or 6 years being my own boss. And I really didn't think that I would want to be managed again for a little while. I just wanted some space. Um, and so I started to look at the things that I had really enjoyed at Bloody Good Period. And the things that sort of lit me up were being able to create a feeling about the work that you're doing through imagery, through language, um, through the partnerships that you make, the connections that people make about you, and how people feel about you, and that's all brand basically. And I never really thought about it at the time as brand. I'd come from arts education. That was my job before. I hadn't really done this work. It was all just quite instinctive. And we eventually, worked with a branding agency who kind of refined the brand and made it sort of more attractive and really designed it up properly. But the stuff that I really loved was being like a challenger, like being like having fun with, different ways of being creative with like images and, different ways that the way that you speak, how that changes how people feel about you as a brand. And so I started to sort of put all these like pieces of the puzzle together, and sort of coupled that with the the rest of the knowledge that I had brought from being a founder. And so that's why I don't sort of strictly refer to myself as like a brand strategist, because I haven't had this traditional trajectory of like going into an ad agency and then, climbing up and being a planner and being a strategist and all of that. It's really come from a different place, a place where I've been a bit of a generalist as well. I've worked with people. I haven't just had my head down in the creative. And really, yeah, that's sort of what came out of it. And I started doing a few different projects, doing that. And probably the best piece of work that I did, and the one that I most enjoyed, was working with a company called Daring Capital. And there was no brand before, Daring Capital, because it was a brand new organization, brand new company that gets investment to underrepresented founders. But the founder really wanted to, stand out as something different, something bold, something daring, and just something that stood differently from the rest of the investment community. And so, I worked with him to create this brand, and we brought in this unbelievable designer called Rebecca Duncan, who did all the visual identity. And I just found that doing that piece of work was like the best thing. I loved it. It was so exciting. And that was about a year ago. And so I thought, well, this is clearly something that I'm meant to do, And so I don't do the, I don't do so much of the activist work anymore because I think it's sort of time for me to rest. But I like being able to help other people who are doing work that's changing the world, who might not have, you know, those skills, which is how to talk about themselves and how to, create an identity, how to ensure that people are talking about you in a good way. And so into that comes, PR, because I've done so much of that, and communications and just general sort of like founder like structure and all of that kind of stuff. And so, yeah, that's what I've continued doing. And now I get to work with mostly small purpose led organizations who want to, either work on their tone of voice, which I'm doing at the moment with one charity, or want to work on their growth, which I'm doing with another company. And how can you use your branding to get you on that road? So yeah, it's a really, really different way of working. It's just me, occasionally with a designer or two, and my client, and it's very like it's much lower stakes. It's really important work, but this isn't about having a team. It's not about, creating a movement. It's just about doing some important work that matters to a few people. And so, yeah, it's different and I love it. And I'm like always changing and growing and learning. And, you have to really take responsibility for your learning as a freelancer. Um, ensuring that you do your own continued professional development and all of that. But yeah, but it's exciting and I like it. And I'm sort of open to what comes next with it.
That's really, really cool. And it's really evident that you enjoy it because you can just hear like how happy you are to talk about it in your voice right now. Um, in your on your website for like your brand nurturing a strategist kind of side, you mentioned that you want to bring joy and credibility and confidence into brands. And so how do you approach this process? And like if someone's listening to this and they're thinking of starting something or they have started something, or even if it's just their kind of brand of like am I and how do I carry myself through the world? What advice would you give them to bring more joy, credibility, and confidence into their life or into their work?
I mean, I think the key part of it is being authentic. And I know that's like a word that everybody chucks around and blah 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 blah. But you can tell when like a person or a brand is being authentic and being themselves and knows who they are. And so I think a massive part of that is like doing a lot of deep diving. And that's generally how I start. Like I want to know everything about like why this organization got started, how they've been going, like what are the things that matter, what don't matter, why what do other people say about them? Like what do they think other people say about them and all of this kind of stuff. And really digging down into what's like the absolute like thing that matters the most. And for Bloody Good Period, that was belonging. That was, who people who need something to belong to because they have been shut out of this conversation or not been allowed to have this conversation forever. And so that's, I think, the thing that's really, really important. And understanding where you are in what's the context of where you or your brand or your organization sits and how are you being able to do it differently, because it would have been really easy for us to just make another like pale pink sort of or company organization that talked about that time of the month or whispers or all of that. But the thing that we wanted to do, or the thing that I wanted to do, was like break the mold basically. So that's the kind of companies that I really want to work with, and that's the kind of branding that works, is when you're doing something differently, not for the sake of doing something differently, but because the old way is not working. And so, doing lots of research into what other people are doing. What do you think isn't right about it? Like, what do you think is something different that you could do, and why could you do it better? And I think the joy and the confidence comes from that. Like when you sort of know who you are and you are steadfast in who you are and what you believe in, and you have values and you act on those values. That's a massive, massive part of branding for me, is like values led work, and not just the values that someone might put on a website and then never look at again. Like, with the work that I do with organizations, we're constantly referring back to, well, what did you say your values were? And does this reflect it? Yeah, that's where the joy and confidence comes from, because you know who you are, and that you can feel that as a person and as a company.
That's really, really, really powerful. And I really like that idea. I want to ask though, have you faced any challenges in trying to get the brands to foster this authenticity and connection with their audiences? Or have you been lucky in that you've kind of scouted out the kind of brands that already had that authentic appeal to them from get-go?
Yeah, I've been lucky in that I've moved quite slowly, and I only want to work with people who really want to do this work and really want to work with me. You know, it's it's not just design. Like, good design is so important, and I love it. And it is the sort of linchpin of everything that I do, and I couldn't work without it. But actually, it is the thinking behind it. And so I tend to work with people who want to do that thinking and who deeply care. And that's one of the reasons that I work with founders a lot, and I enjoy working with founders, is because they care more than somebody working at a company, and that's just completely natural. And I think it would be weird if someone who worked at some big company cared as deeply as a founder does about their small organization. But yeah, so I've been really lucky. I haven't faced the resistance in doing the work that I do, thankfully. But there's absolutely conversations that I'll have with people who could potentially be clients, and I just think we're not on the same page, and that's cool. Like, it's a different way of working, and we care about different things. And look, that's the joy of working for yourself, is that you get to decide, whether that works for you or not.
That's really important. And I think that links to earlier what you were saying about when you worked in activism, knowing how much you can give and like learning to say no. I think like learning to say no is something that can be really out of someone's comfort zone, especially if they want to do everything and they want to help every cause and they want to be the best version of themselves and stuff. So, what has been your journey with learning to say no, and what advice would you give to someone who wants to be more discerning in what projects and what work they can take on and what like they can't?
Give you a really good name drop, right? I never do this, but they reminded me. I was at an event with Bloody Good Period in like 2018, and I smelt this amazing perfume behind me. And I turned around and I was like, oh my God, what is that perfume? That's amazing. And the woman behind me said, oh, I can't remember who she said it was. It was Annie Lennox. Does that mean anything to you?
I don't want to admit no, but no.
So she was, you just made me just scroll.
I don't want to be cancelled.
Okay. So she was in a band called the Eurythmics. It was a really big, like, they're amazing. Like, Spotify her. Like, she's got the most incredible voice, and she's also an activist. So she's older than us. She's been doing this work for a long time, and she does loads and loads of activism. God, it's like yeah, honestly, like, she's almost would be like the generation before me is like Taylor Swift. Like, she's a big deal. She's a really big deal. And so I couldn't believe that I had met her. Right. I couldn't believe it. And so later on, like, I like struck up the courage, and I went over with my friend who was also an activist. And we were like, Annie, we're we're activists. What advice have you got for us? I think we said it a bit cooler than that. And she basically said, learn to say no. And I was like, well, okay, but what do you mean? She was like, when you say no, it enables you to say yes to other things. And it was just the simplest advice, but I'm still learning it today. Like, saying yes also means that you're saying no to other things. So if you just say yes to everything, it means that you're automatically saying no to anything else that you could have done within that time frame or that energy capacity. So yeah, so Annie Lennox told me to learn to say no, and it was one of the best moments of my life. But it's always a work in progress. I think a lot of the time it's like learning to trust your gut. Like, what's your body saying about something? Not long ago, a friend of mine asked me to do a piece of work with her, and as she was describing it, I could feel myself tensing up. Like, I was listening to myself, and I was like, oh, I'm getting really bad stomach ache, and my chest is feeling constricted, and I was like, oh, I don't want to do it. And like, learning to be able to listen to those like bodily cues as well has been something really, really important to me. And I don't think I would have known that during, really good period times. I think that's something I learned coming out of it. But I think it's something that anybody can start to try and tune into if they're able to. Um, so learning to listen to those no's has been really, really important to me, as well as just the sort of like intellectual. Obviously, no, I can't do that. I don't have time, you know?
Thank you so, so much for sharing that. And I feel really, really grateful that this was one of your yeses and you agreed to have this conversation with me. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Empower Sounds podcast. I really hope that you enjoyed. And if you did, please let me know on the podcast Instagram, reach out at Empower Sounds, and I will see you next week.